Welcome to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Russell. In this podcast, we'll talk about how data and analytics are transforming the forest products industry. We'll share how a research-based approach to analytics can empower your forestry organization to make better decisions with your data. Welcome everyone to today's podcast. This episode is going to talk about carbon. Specifically, carbon in harvested wood products. I like to say that carbon is the hottest commodity in our forests in the 2020s, and for good reasons. Obviously, as carbon is intimately linked with climate, as we think about trees and forests as natural climate solutions, the discussion of carbon, how much carbon we have, where is it located in the forest, how is it changing, how is it distributed in the forest, whether it be different carbon pools, whether it's stored in the live trees, in deadwood, or in soils. Lots of us are thinking about carbon. So taking a step back from that, carbon dioxide is obviously the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions. And obviously as we burn fossil fuels for transportation and energy, that's kind of our interest in understanding trees as they relate to sequestering that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So if we have healthy trees and we have healthy forests, we can increase carbon storage and avoid some of those greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, a lot of companies, a lot of policymakers, decision makers are interested in capitalizing on these aspects as they relate to natural climate solutions. And so lots of carbon markets are coming on board, many in the private world, offering payments to landowners for some of the carbon benefits that their trees provide. And so you'll hear things like climate smart forestry and things like that relate to better understanding our forests and how they relate to carbon and forest management. And so when we look at forests, they're obviously a net sink, at least here in the United States, meaning that they absorb more carbon dioxide than they emit. And so the Forest Service, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Forest Service, they do a inventory every year using forest inventory and analysis data. And we know that, at least in recent years, forests and the harvested wood products from them offset about 11% of all the greenhouse gas emissions. So an incredible sink that is found in our forests as it relates to carbon. And so obviously our forests are challenged. There are lots of major forest disturbances that have occurred. Think about wildfires, blowdowns, insects and disease outbreaks. But on the whole, United States forests continue to store more carbon. And so carbon in forest, back to 1990, if we look at 1990, that's a common year that we use in reporting a lot of carbon numbers, because a lot of that relates to the Kyoto Protocol as it relates to climate change in our forests. If we look back to 1990, we know that our forests in the U.S. Had about 50,913 million metric tons of carbon. And so just an incredible sink. Today, or at least the last estimate back in 2019, was 55,993 million metric tons of carbon in our forests. And so despite all the wildfires that we see in the news across the U.S., despite all the disturbances that we're facing, forests are still a net sink and have increased over time. And so foresters and loggers often deal with the carbon in live trees, but obviously they're not the only component. We can also think about what's in the roots of trees, what's in the branches, but also the deadwood pools, including snags and coarse woody debris, the litter, and obviously the soil pools being a big component of that. So it really brings us to what I wanted to chat about today is the importance of carbon in harvested wood products. And so those are always reported in many of the estimates from the U.S. Forest Service and from the Environmental Protection Agency in their annual greenhouse gas inventory. And so it's incredibly important to include those as a part of the overall carbon portfolio of our country. Obviously, carbon that's locked up in harvested wood products is incredibly important. So you can imagine, say, a mass timber building designed with wood. And so obviously that wood is not going to be emitted. If it was a forest fire, that wood would have burned and been immediately emitted into the atmosphere. But if we're designing buildings, we're using more wood in the marketplace, that wood is going to lock up the carbon in those trees. That's going to store that carbon for centuries, for decades, into the future. And so where I sit in Minneapolis, we have a 7-story mass timber building in downtown Minneapolis that's doing exactly this. It's a building made of wood, and that building, if it's around for at least 50 years, all of the wood that's been to create that building is just going to stay there. And so it's going to be locked up in that building. And so when we look more specifically about harvested wood products and specifically the carbon that's stored in them, we can think about them coming from 2 primary sectors, products in use and solid waste disposal sites. And so when you think about all those harvested wood products, they're all wood-derived products: furniture, plywood, paper, energy. Any wood that's harvested that remains in use for products for a given length of time. So obviously, if you think about a resource, trees being used to make pulp or paper, well, that's going to have a much shorter life cycle than, say, a utility pole, and that can serve up to about a century. And so if you want to kind of understand a complete life cycle of carbon accounting, understanding how these different wood products vary and how fast or slowly they decay relates to how much potential they can emit back into the atmosphere. And so solid waste disposal sites are also a tremendous amount of wood storage. And so typically these are notable when wood products reach the end of their life cycles. And so you can think about the wood in landfills and dumps where that wood is slowly decaying for decades. And so a common metric that we use to assume is a half-life for wood is about 29 years. And that's based on some work from the Forest Service and others. And so that would mean that it would take about 29 years for half of the biomass in a block of wood to decay. And so if we understand that, we can better understand the full life cycle of the carbon in our atmosphere and stored in our wood products. What's interesting about harvested wood products is that they too have increased at least since 1990 in the U.S. And so according to recent estimates, these pools were about 1,500 million metric tons of carbon back in 1990. You need to look at those numbers more closely. So they represented about 1,500 million metric tons in harvested wood products and about 1,100 million metric tons of carbon in solid waste disposal sites, at least going back to 2019. And so this is really important because this means that they've increased 23% for the products in use since 1990 and 81% for the solid waste disposal site carbon since 1990. And so just an incredible amount of growth, not only in the total amount of carbon stored in harvested wood products, but also in the proportion of how much carbon that represents for the total forest carbon pool that's represented. And so this is really important. That increase in forest ecosystem carbon within the forest has increased by about 10% since 1990. And so compared to 23% increase in harvested wood products, 81% increase in solid waste disposal sites, that's just an incredible amount, at least compared to just how the forests are growing. And so because of this, carbon stored in harvested wood products has contributed a lot more to the total carbon storage in the U.S., at least when we look at it on a relative scale, comparing those different proportions. And so if you look at the total forest ecosystem, so that would include everything from harvested wood products and what's in the ecosystem. Harvested wood products represented about 3.7% of all the forest carbon stored in the U.S. back in 1990. Most recent estimates in 2019, they represent 5% of all carbon stocks. And so it's an increasing proportion that's found in harvested wood products. And so obviously this makes harvested wood products a net sink for carbon, especially given the increases in the contribution of harvested wood products. It's a reflection of the productive economy that the forest industry has had over the last several decades, even with incorporating a lot of mill closures and a lot of paper mills being shut down with just the decreased use in paper and products here in the last decade or two. That includes the Great Recession, when obviously the overall economy took a big hit. And so it's really interesting to compare that, even with all the challenges that the forest industry has had, with all of the challenges that our forests have had, from wildfires to insect and disease outbreaks to blowdown and all of those things. Despite that, the increase in carbon and specifically in harvested wood products has really been an interesting phenomenon here in the last several decades. And so this is really just a key thing, something I wanted to point out about the role of harvested wood products. If you think about the whole carbon portfolio of the U.S., it should really make anyone that works in the forest industry proud, to recognize the role that wood plays in terms of sequestering and locking up carbon if it's used in wood products. And so I think it's really a point that people working in the forest products industry can point to, and that they have a role too in natural climate solutions by providing some of these products that can be used in long-lived forest products, whether it be mass timber buildings or using more wood in regular building and things like that. And so I think lots of benefits that the forest products industry can point to and how they play a role in the carbon and climate challenges that our world is faced with here moving into future generations. And so that kind of does it for a recap of the importance of harvested wood products in the carbon cycle. I wrote a post on this in May 2021 that I'll also link to in the notes for this podcast. And so I'd always love to hear your feedback. If you have feedback, feel free to reach out. I can be reached if you head to the website arbor-analytics.com. My contact info is there. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. For more information on how data and analytics can empower your organization, visit arbor-analytics.com.